Canada just exposed America's biggest weakness, and Washington has no answer. There's a sentence that was spoken out loud, in public, into a microphone, by the Prime Minister of one of America's oldest and closest allies that should have sent shockwaves through every embassy, every trading floor, and every geopolitical strategy room in Washington, D.C. He didn't whisper it. He didn't bury it in a policy document. He stood in front of a business audience in Calgary, looked straight into the cameras, and said this: over 95% of all our energy exports went to the States. This tight interdependence, once a strength, is now a weakness. Let that sit for a moment. The Prime Minister of Canada just told the world that his country's most important trading relationship, a relationship worth over $900 billion a year, is now a liability, not a partnership, not an alliance, a weakness that needs to be dismantled, rerouted, and replaced. And here is what nobody in the mainstream political conversation is connecting clearly enough. When Canada calls its dependence on America a weakness, it isn't just commenting on its own vulnerability. It is, deliberately or not, announcing something far more significant about America's position in the world. Because if your closest neighbor, the country that shares the longest international border on the planet, the country that buys more American goods than any other, the country that has fought alongside U.S. troops in every major conflict for the last 100 years, if that country has concluded that betting on America is a bad investment, then America doesn't just have a trade problem. America has a strategic problem, and Canada is exposing it for the entire world to see. Stay with me, because what has unfolded over the past year is one of the most significant geopolitical shifts in modern North American history. And it is happening right on America's doorstep in slow motion right now as you watch this. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to February 1st, 2025. That was the day the Trump administration signed executive orders imposing sweeping tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports, 25% on most goods, 10% on Canadian oil and energy. The stated justification was border security, fentanyl, illegal immigration. But analysts watching the situation closely said something else was going on. This wasn't targeted enforcement. This was economic coercion. For decades, the United States and Canada operated under an assumption, a comfortable, mutually beneficial assumption, that the two countries were so deeply intertwined, so economically fused, so militarily integrated, that a serious rupture between them was simply unthinkable. They shared NORAD. They shared supply chains that crisscrossed the border hundreds of times before a finished product reached store shelves. They shared a trading relationship so massive it was the backbone of both economies. That assumption is now dead. What followed those February tariffs was not just a trade dispute. It was something far uglier. Trump began floating the idea of annexing Canada, openly, repeatedly. Not as a joke, or if it started as one, Canadian officials made clear they stopped laughing fast. According to reports, senior officials in Ottawa were briefed that the annexation rhetoric was not idle provocation. It was being taken seriously as a pressure tactic by a U.S. administration that genuinely seemed to believe it could bully a sovereign nation into submission through economic pain and psychological intimidation. Canada responded the way you respond when you realize the person you trusted most has become someone you no longer recognize. It started building an exit. And here's where this story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because what Canada has done since early 2025 is not panic. It is not retreat. It is not a country scrambling to appease a hostile neighbor. It is a country executing a deliberate, calculated, multi-front strategic pivot. And the speed and scope of it should alarm anyone paying attention in Washington. Let's go through it move by move. In January 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney flew to Beijing, not to scold China, not to posture, to cut a deal. Canada agreed to reduce tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1% for the first 49,000 vehicles imported each year. In exchange, China agreed to slash retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 84% down to approximately 15%. Canadian farmers, who had been bleeding for nearly a year under Chinese retaliation, got relief. Chinese EV manufacturers got access to a new market. And Canada got something arguably more valuable than either: a functioning, predictable trading relationship with the world's second largest economy. Carney's words after the deal were striking. He described the relationship with China as now being more predictable than the relationship with the United States. Let that register. The Prime Minister of Canada, the same man who had publicly called China the biggest security threat facing his country less than a year earlier, was now saying that dealing with Beijing was more reliable than dealing with Washington. The U.S. Trade Representative called the deal problematic, said Canada might regret it, and yet even Trump himself unpredictably said, if you can get a deal with China, you should do that. Washington didn't know whether to condemn Canada or congratulate it. That confusion is itself a signal. It reveals an administration that has no coherent strategy, that has pushed a trusted ally toward its most significant geopolitical rival, and then can't even decide if that's a problem. Critics argue it is very much a problem, because for every Canadian EV tariff lifted, Chinese manufacturers gain a foothold in North America that they didn't have before. For every ton of Chinese-made goods flowing into Canadian ports, America's strategic encirclement of China loses one more seam. While the China deal grabbed headlines, Canada was simultaneously executing a quieter but arguably deeper realignment toward Europe. In the first 11 months of 2025, Canadian exports to the United Kingdom hit $42.5 billion. That is nearly a 60% increase compared to the previous year. The UK overtook China as Canada's second largest export market, not through luck, through deliberate policy, through diplomatic relationships actively nurtured while the US-Canada relationship was burning. But it didn't stop there. Canada became the first non-European Union nation to formally join the EU's SAFE program, the Security Action for Europe Rearmament Initiative. This is a defense funding mechanism, a military-industrial alignment, and Canada walked through that door not as an observer or a junior partner, but as a full participant. Think about what that means. Canada is now architecturally embedded in European defense structures that exist in part as an alternative to dependence on the United States. Then came the Defense Bank. Canada and the United Kingdom jointly launched a new institution, a financial mechanism designed explicitly to fund allied defense capability without routing money through Washington. Analysts called it historic. Others called it the first institutional brick in a new transatlantic security architecture that doesn't have America at its center. Here is the piece of this story that keeps defense analysts awake at night and the piece that gets the least attention in mainstream coverage. Canada is spending money in the Arctic at a pace it has never attempted before. $82 billion over 5 years in new defense spending, $32 billion specifically committed to expanding military airfields in the north and building 4 new operational support hubs, a commitment to hit NATO's new spending benchmark of 5% of GDP by 2035. Canada also built a $900 million domestic drone hub, a facility designed to manufacture unmanned systems inside its own borders, reducing dependence on foreign suppliers and creating a domestic defense industrial base in a sector that now defines modern warfare. The framing out of Ottawa is explicit. This is sovereignty spending. This is Canada saying, we will no longer rely on the assumption that America will protect us, because America has demonstrated that it does not see us as an ally to protect. It sees us as a territory to pressure. And then there is the pipeline. Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed an agreement to advance a Pacific Coast pipeline, a route that would carry Canadian oil specifically from the Alberta oil sands to the coast of British Columbia, where it would be loaded onto tankers bound for Asia, for China, for Japan, for South Korea. Over 164 billion barrels of proven oil reserves sit under Alberta. For decades, nearly all of it flowed south into American refineries, American supply chains, American gas tanks. The U.S. Midwest runs on Canadian crude. Some estimates suggest that any serious disruption to Canadian oil supplies would trigger immediate energy shortfalls in American industrial states. Washington always assumed that energy dependence was Canada's problem, that Canada needed American consumers more than America needed Canadian oil. Carney's government is in the process of proving that assumption dangerously wrong. If that pipeline reaches the Pacific, Canadian energy has a new buyer, a buyer that doesn't threaten annexation, a buyer that doesn't call your country the 51st state, a buyer that, for all its own complications, pays the bill without the political theater. Now, here is where this stops being a bilateral dispute between neighbors and becomes something with genuinely global dimensions. Because what Canada is doing is not unique to Canada. It is the leading edge of a broader realignment, a quiet but accelerating global shift in which American allies are asking the same question. Can we still count on Washington? And one by one, they are arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. Look at the evidence. When Trump asked 7 countries to send warships to support U.S. military operations, every single one said no. Not one ally complied. When Canada's Carney flew to Oslo and united 5 nations in a coordinated response to U.S. pressure with no coordinating role for Washington, the Atlantic Alliance showed a fracture it had never shown before. When Carney stood with Macron in Paris and issued what analysts described as a direct ultimatum to the Trump administration, stop the 51st state rhetoric, or there will be no deal, it was the language of equals, not the language of a subordinate. The United States has spent 80 years building a system of alliances, trade agreements, security arrangements, financial institutions, and diplomatic norms that collectively made America the undisputed center of global power. That system, critics now argue, is being dismantled not by China, not by Russia, not by any external rival. It is being dismantled by the United States itself. And Canada's strategic turn is the clearest, most measurable, most documented proof of it. Consider the USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, painstakingly negotiated across multiple administrations. It is now under a mandatory review. Trade advisors operating out of Washington have gone on record saying there is a reasonable chance that 2026 ends without a meaningful, workable trade deal between the United States and Canada. Think about how impossible that sentence would have sounded 5 years ago. Today it is being said, not by critics, not by opposition commentators, but by advisors who work in Washington and are watching it happen in real time. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually struck down the IEEPA tariffs that triggered this entire crisis, but the damage had already been done. Not the economic damage, though that was significant. The deeper damage, the trust damage. The psychological and diplomatic damage of Canada learning, at full institutional speed, that the United States is no longer a stable partner, that it is a variable, not a constant, and variables get priced differently. Step back even further, because what is happening with Canada sits inside a much larger story about American power and the weakness it is increasingly showing to the world. For decades, the United States ran a particular form of global dominance. It wasn't only about military force, though that was always in the background. It was about being indispensable, about being the country at the center of every supply chain, every financial network, every security architecture. America's power was, at its core, structural. It was woven into the fabric of how the global economy worked. That structural power rested on one critical assumption, that the allies and trading partners inside that system had more to gain from staying than from leaving. The Trump administration's approach to Canada and to allies more broadly challenged that assumption deliberately. It asked, what if we squeeze our partners hard enough? Will they comply or will they bolt? Canada answered that question, and the answer was they bolt. The implications ripple outward in every direction. Analysts have started openly discussing in mainstream financial publications and not fringe corners of the internet whether the US dollar's status as the dominant global reserve currency faces structural headwinds for the first time in decades. Not because China's renminbi is ready to replace it, it isn't, but because country after country is quietly reducing its exposure to the dollar-denominated system. Hedging, diversifying, not because they found something better, but because they no longer fully trust the center. The Arctic is perhaps the most underreported strategic dimension of the Canada story. It is not just frozen wilderness. It is the next major theater of great power competition. It holds vast, untapped energy reserves, rare minerals, and as climate change opens northern sea routes, it will become one of the most strategically important shipping corridors on Earth. Canada controls more Arctic territory than almost any other nation. And right now, Canada is building military infrastructure in that territory, not in coordination with the United States, but in response to what it perceives as pressure from the United States. Russia is watching. China is watching. They are watching a moment when America's most important northern neighbor is making sovereignty investments that could, over time, shift who controls the Arctic strategic environment. For generations, The United States possessed something economists and strategists call soft power, the ability to attract, inspire, and lead through the appeal of its values, its culture, and its example. Canada was one of the most reliable amplifiers of that soft power, a stable, prosperous, aligned neighbor whose very existence validated the idea that American-style liberal democracy worked. Today, Canadian public opinion toward the United States has collapsed to historic lows. The narrative inside Canada, in its media, its political conversation, its cultural identity, has shifted from partnership to defiance, from alignment to strategic autonomy. That is not a small thing. That is a generational shift that, once it hardens, does not reverse easily. And here's the question that no one in Washington's political class seems willing to answer honestly. If Canada, peaceful, prosperous, deeply integrated Canada, has decided that it cannot count on America, what does that say to every other ally watching? What does it say to Japan, nervously calculating its exposure to U.S. trade policy while watching its own relationship with Beijing? What does it say to South Korea, triangulating between American security guarantees and Chinese economic pressure? What does it say to Germany, France, the European Union, partners who were already questioning American reliability after watching the NATO discourse deteriorate under pressure? The message Canada is sending, whether it intends to or not, is this: it is possible to decouple from America. It takes courage, it takes strategy, and it takes sacrifice. But it is possible, and it is survivable. That is the weakness Canada is exposing, not a trade deficit, not a tariff dispute. The weakness of an America that has chosen to be unreliable and is now discovering that reliability, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. There is something almost tragic about the arc of this story, because the United States and Canada were not rivals. They were not adversaries. They were the closest thing the modern world has produced to a genuine strategic partnership between equal nations. They shared intelligence, they shared airspace, they shared borders that generations of families crossed without a second thought. They built something real. And now a Canadian Prime Minister stands in front of business leaders and calls that relationship a weakness. Now Canada is signing energy deals with China. Now Canada is joining European defense funds. Now Canada is building its own weapon systems, its own drone hubs, its own financial institutions designed to function without American involvement. Now Carney meets with Macron, unites Nordic nations in Oslo, and issues ultimatums to Washington while Washington scrambles to find a response that doesn't exist. Supporters of the Trump approach will argue this is necessary disruption, that allies who were freeloading on American security guarantees needed to be shaken awake. That Canada spending more on defense and diversifying its economy is actually a good outcome. And there is a version of that argument that contains truth. But critics point to something the scoreboard doesn't show. Who won? Because America didn't push Canada toward independence and then fill the vacuum with a stronger deal. America pushed Canada toward independence and then watched it walk toward Beijing, Brussels, and London. The leverage was spent, the pressure was applied, and the outcome was the opposite of compliance. It was defection. Every empire in history has had a moment like this, a moment when it mistook fear for loyalty, when it confused compliance with partnership, when it applied force where it needed trust. The Roman Empire had these moments. The British Empire had them. Every great power at some point looked at the map and saw the edges beginning to peel. Nobody is saying America is collapsing. Nobody serious is writing that off. The United States remains the most powerful economy and the most capable military force on Earth. Those facts are not in dispute. But power has layers, and the layer that Canada is peeling back, the layer of trusted, willing, voluntary alliance, that layer is not easily replaced. It cannot be rebuilt with a tariff rollback or a photo opportunity at a summit. It takes years. It takes credibility. It takes a kind of strategic patience that right now seems to be in short supply. Mark Carney said the words that matter. He said them publicly. He said them deliberately. This tight interdependence, once a strength, is now a weakness. He was talking about Canada's dependence on America, but analysts watching the full picture are starting to wonder if the sentence works in reverse. If the real weakness being exposed is not Canada's dependence on America, but America's dependence on the idea that its allies will never leave, because Canada just started leaving. And Washington, for all its power, for all its military might, for all its financial firepower, doesn't seem to have a plan for that. If you've made it this far, you already know this matters. Drop a comment below. Do you think Washington will course correct before it's too late? Or has the damage already been done? Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the stories that the headlines are only half telling, because this one is far from over.